Entonces vamos a entrar en los grupos
So we're going to go into our small groups, our working groups, to be able to start building relationships, offering mutual aid, and to find ways to support each other. But before we go into our working groups, I would like to ask you that if there was somebody in the group that could take notes or taking down what everybody's saying so that then you can be shared in the chat with the big group. Lots of groups will have people from one of our organizations, our sponsoring organizations, that can take notes. But as you can see, there are various different sectors that are represented today. And we want to know what you're talking about in your working groups. We also have people that serve a specific county, and then there's people who serve different counties. And we can see too here where the different participants are located. And we have some really recent registrations, and so it could be that there's even more people. And here's a map showing where all the participants are working. So we have almost everything covered for the state. We can see all of these people, all the participants from this call. We also have here that the majority of our participants identify as Latino, and we have a diversity in this group. We have a bunch of different identities represented. So now we're going to go into our great breakout groups. And we ask for you to share with the group your name, your affiliations, and talk about the main problem that you see in your community. And then we're going to share this information in the chat.
Take some time and keep dropping those notes there in the group chat. All of this will be compiled into a meeting summary, just like we did for session number 1. And that is going to then show up, get sent out around to everybody. So you will all have that. You'll also have a copy of the slides. There's not a whole lot on the slides, but I can definitely send them around to you. And anyone who said that it's okay to share their contact information, we'll be sharing that out too. Let me name a few things that I see in the chat. Large Hispanic populations with little community outreach. People are not getting testing information and receiving help. So a big theme around communication with communities. How do we get information sent out in Spanish and sent out immediately in Spanish? How do we get more representation from Latino, Latinx populations in county and state emergency management? We are going to turn over now while people are doing that. And I want to introduce y'all to some panelists that we've got here today. We have, last week the conversation was how do community organizations support disaster resilience in Latino communities? This week, we want to ask this other question, which is how do public agencies respond to disasters in 2020? We've got 4 great panelists here. Caroline Farmer is with the Office of the Governor. Dan Altenau is with Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Raleigh. He's also on the board in the leadership of North Carolina Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. Ross Patterson is with the Salvation Army, and Sandi Bridges is with North Carolina Emergency Management. I'm going to ask my colleague Philip to help, because there's so many people on the call. I'm going to ask my colleague Philip to help spotlight folks as they are talking. And I've got a couple of questions, and then we'll go back to some breakout groups and then return and finish up with our panel. Let me start with Sandi with North Carolina Emergency Management. Sandi, emergency management at the state level, that's sort of the bread and butter of the centralized response from public agencies. Can you tell us what's your role and what's emergency management's role in disaster recovery and response?
Sure. So my role is the Human Services Branch Manager, and so I focus a lot on helping to make sure that across the state we are set in anything really related to human services. So that's anything from sheltering to feeding. That also includes pet sheltering, and then also some of those wraparound services that go along with those. So mental health, general outreach, working with volunteers active in disaster. So it's a kind of a broad-reaching role. As far as the role of emergency management in general, that kind of looks a little bit different depending on what level you're at. So essentially, across the board, emergency management is responsible for making sure that the state or local community that we're in charge of or are responsible for are prepared for disasters, and that includes the community members that belong to that community. As far as what it looks like from the state side versus a local side, it does look a little bit different. So if I'll speak from the local side simply because I just came from being local, and that's where I've always been. But on the local side, it's very much the role to make sure that the people in my community are taken care of, that I've done outreach to the people around me, that I am planning for those people. At the state level, our job is a little bit different in the sense that it is our role to assist those counties. So those counties have a lot of resources, they have a lot of ability and capability on their own, and so they don't necessarily need the state to step in and help in all areas. But there are times, depending on how large the storm or the incident may be, they may not have quite enough to meet the needs of the people in their counties or their community. So it's at that point that they wind up coming to the state to say, hey, we have this gap, we have this need, and can you help fill in that gap or that need? And so I'm doing a lot more planning kind of statewide to say, okay, what are the gaps that you know that you have that we can kind of fill that in, and we can help you respond however you need it. So that's kind of the responsibilities at the different levels.
Hearing you say that emergency management starts on the local level, but when the local level either gets overwhelmed or there are gaps, that they turn to the state for that. I want to ask you, because I know you also have got a couple of things going on today, you know, because there's a pandemic and all kinds of other stuff. But I wanted to ask you, how does the Human Services Branch specifically serve Latinx populations?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So from the state level, it kind of again goes back to what is the need of the county that needs the support. So a lot of what I found having come from a county EM is that a lot of the outreach to that Latinx community really starts at that local level, because at the state level, I don't necessarily get into the community and have those conversations in the same way because I have such a large group or a large community to be looking out for. But at that local level, that's where those conversations can really happen. That's where it's my neighbor is part of the community, and that's who I really build those relationships with. So the Human Services Branch at the state level is very much about continuing to support the counties and how they do that. And sometimes that's through training, sometimes it's through conversations like this, just to make sure that there's general awareness. And then sometimes it's also about going back and just asking those questions to say, hey, a lot of counties are doing a good job with this, but other counties might need someone to remind them and say, hey, don't forget about all of these other populations. Make sure that your communication is there. And then with some of the counties where they may not have the resources to do all of the translating or do everything that they need, that's another thing that they come to us about and say, okay, the Joint Information Center at the state level, when you put that out, can you put it out in Spanish as well so that we can share it back to that community?
Sandi, you are trying to put so much good information in a short amount of time, and the only thing is I'll ask, can you slow down just a little bit for our interpreters to allow them to catch up? seeing Alex talk about that communication issues have been apparent across the board, and that one of the things I think folks are looking for is maybe the state to help build trust with Latino communities. Is that something that the state emergency management has been thinking about? How to build that trust?
Yes, so that is something that we have been thinking about, and certainly something that we want to be engaged in. I think the challenge that we run into at the state level goes back to what I mentioned before, in that it's very much a community-based situation. And so being that I'm in Raleigh, I can't necessarily have that conversation with an Eastern county in the same way that if I worked in that county, I could. And so we certainly have those conversations, and are always open to suggestions on how at the state level we can help with that. We get a lot of questions from media and different folks asking how are we doing that, and that it very much has to be a partnership with that local level as well. And so that is where we're going to be able to get those needs, because I think part of the issue is being at the state level, sitting in Raleigh, I'm not necessarily aware of every issue that happens in the field or every thing that pops up in a particular community. So until that's passed to me, either by the county or by an organization working in that area, I don't know because I'm not there. So that is something that at the state level is a little bit of a challenge, but it is also something that is always at the forefront of our minds, because we want to make sure that all populations are taken care of, and that there aren't any that fall through the cracks or are just not taken care of because we didn't put in some energy and some effort.
There's a comment in the chat that I want to build off of, and I know, again, let me know when you've got to dip out, but if you got time for one more question, there's the elephant in the room is that there's a global pandemic, and so hurricane season looks very different this year than it does in previous years. And Beatrice is making the point that Hispanics in particular are vastly represented in the infection rate numbers. So let me ask, how does disaster response and preparedness look different in 2020? What should communities be thinking about and doing differently, and what are you doing differently?
Sure. So we've had to make a lot of changes, obviously, as everyone has. As far as what looks differently this year, we are really stressing to anybody who has the ability to find friends or family to go stay with instead of going to a shelter. And I know that that's easier in some communities than in others, and so I don't pretend like that's the only solution. But that is one thing that we've really had to focus on, is how do we encourage as many people as possible who have the ability to go stay with friends or family to do that, to then allow the folks who can't do that the ability to be in a shelter or to be in that other location and be socially distanced appropriately. So messaging, I think this season doesn't necessarily change the type of message and what's actually in the message changes, but the actual methodology would be about the same. It's more a matter of, once the storm is approaching or once something like that is happening, how do we make sure that everybody who shows up to a shelter, everybody who needs that housing and that help is able to get it, and is able to get it as safely as possible. So we've also focused on the recommendation from the Red Cross and FEMA and the CDC is to focus on non-congregate sheltering. And so the counties continue to be responsible for sheltering and making sure that their people are taken care of, but with the guidance that requires extra space in a shelter, the capacity in each shelter goes down a good bit. And so the counties may need the state's help a lot sooner than they normally would. When that transition becomes part of the state's responsibility, we are trying to make sure that we focus on non-congregate sheltering as much as possible. And so that may mean hotels, it might mean a camp that has cabins and we can put individual families in. We are really focused on trying to make sure that we have the ability to spread people out as much as possible. And then understanding that that may wind up filling up pretty quickly, we may have to transition to congregate and make sure that people are spread out. So I think for this season, one of the things that I would want to encourage anybody on this call that works with any of the Latinx population is to really be making sure that they're sharing that information with them, to say it's going to look differently this year. It may be that you get a hotel room. It may be that you wind up in a shelter. It just depends on how much space that we have, but be aware that we will need you to wear masks. We do want to make sure social distancing is happening, because our priority is, we're having to balance priorities. We want to make sure people are as safe from the storm as possible, while also making sure they're as safe from the pandemic as possible. Did that answer your question?
So balancing priorities is a key thing. And also I heard you recognize that some of the recommendations that are coming out of the state and out of national guidance, they're ideal recommendations, and they don't always work for all types of populations. And in fact, that's something that in our next set of breakout groups that we're going to be asking people this sort of standard set of questions that Rural Forward often asks of what sounds right, what's surprising, what's wrong, what needs to be different here. Sandi, I know you may need to slip out, and I also want to make sure that we're getting a chance to talk with some of our other panelists. So thank you very much for taking some time today to do that. Let me ask Ross Patterson. Ross is with the Salvation Army. Ross, could you talk a little bit about what is your role, knowing that the Salvation Army is a partner with an integrated partner in disaster response and resiliency. And again, I ask you to slow down a little bit with the language so that our interpreters can keep up.
Sure, yes. So we are a partner, and I will say that we're a partner on both the state and again at the local level. So our agency, as Salvation Army, is a local agency. While we are not in all 100 counties, we have somebody who is responsible for all 100 counties. So each of our Salvation Army Corps, the church, does have responsibility for a set amount of counties depending on their area. So we rely on them heavily to engage at the local level, just like what Sandi was talking about, ensuring that we are finding out what's going on in those communities, and to and each one of our programs looks a little different in each of those communities. Depends on the community itself, so how it is, what the needs are of the community as on a day-to-day basis. So it may not look exactly the same in Wake County as it does in Clay County. So it varies, and again, this depends on the availability of resources we have in those communities. But when we talk about disasters and how we respond, and that partnership that we have with the counties, and then also the partnership we have with the state, it's the exact same way as Sandi was describing it. You know, it starts at the local level. The county is responsible for those basic human services that we rely on, and then us as a nonprofit come alongside the county to help where we can. So again, depends on what's happening in those areas, if we can even get into those communities. So when we talk about disasters, now the long-term part, when we start talking about resiliency and recovery, again, that's going to look different disaster to disaster. It depends for us, as any other nonprofit, depends on what we get as far as donations go. So we may or may not be able to provide in that community, just depends on the donations. We don't keep a coffer. We spend the money on that disaster when the money we get for that disaster on that disaster. So we don't save it. We want to make sure we get that money and that donations and that product or whatever else we're providing into the community out there. So, yep.
Oh, sorry. I was going to ask, when you're saying it differs from storm to storm or disaster to disaster. And one of the things that was a big thing that came out of even already the first breakout group we had is communication in Spanish and resources in Spanish. And I'm curious, does the Salvation Army have bilingual, bicultural staff? Do you put resources out in Spanish? How do you serve the Latino community and Spanish-speaking community?
So we have, and one of my peers is on the call as well, and they're working very heavily. We're starting to work with the migrant populations. We're looking more towards folks that are in crisis and in need, as far as your migrants or your folks that are being trafficked and stuff like that. So we're working towards that, and that's where our biggest Spanish population, our Spanish speakers, are coming from, and working with those populations. But yes, it depends on the community. If we only have a staff of 3 and none of them are Spanish speaker or any other language, then we have to rely on other assets to be able to get that information out there. So yes, it does look different even when it comes to translation and what we provide. As we provide stuff in writing. We try to get it translated and make sure we're doing that. I know during Michael, that was the biggest push. Any documentation we sent out, we wanted to make sure there was a Spanish language interpretation to go along with that. So we in the nonprofit world are recognizing that more and more, and we're trying our best. But again, we're limited to the staff on hand, and again, working off of donations, it's pretty hard sometimes to get a bilingual or to even just focus on that one particular language. But we're doing better.
I'm hearing, I'm seeing in the chat some folks saying that the language is a way to start building that trust, and then start bringing in more volunteers and bringing in others. I want to ask Dan Altenau, who's also with another VOAD, a voluntary organization active in disaster, VOAD, in Catholic Charities. Dan, could you talk a little bit about the other hat that you wear is with North Carolina voluntary organizations active in disaster. Could you talk just a little bit about how NC VOAD works to coordinate and some of the things that y'all have been thinking about, and especially that LTRG structure?
Absolutely. One theme that has been mentioned multiple times already is all disasters start local and all disasters end local. And that's something we really try to respect and prioritize at North Carolina VOAD level. And so North Carolina VOAD historically has been, its primary purpose is a convening space for groups that are focused on conducting disaster response activities, to provide that room to talk about coordinating communication and collaboration around responding to a disaster, similar to what we're trying to accomplish here with this group. And so historically, it had been more of mainstream organizations, your Salvation Army, your Red Cross, and we've really been trying to conduct active outreach. There's always been open. There's a membership application process, but we hold coordinates and have email lists that are open to everyone, whether you're a member or not. But one area I think we have room to grow in is in recruiting new members and just recruiting people to join the VOAD movement, whether they join as members or just participate in the coordination calls, and in part of that process to get connected to resources. We're really trying to advertise that more now, and educate other people and break out of kind of our bubble so that more people are aware of the resources that are available. And one way we do it, tying it back to the all disasters start and end local, is through the concept of a long-term recovery group. A long-term recovery group, or community organizations active in disaster, COAD, takes the statewide nature of North Carolina VOAD and brings it to a more local level. We've seen since Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Matthew, a lot of long-term recovery groups pop up. I know Phil Triplett's on this call. Maybe he can drop in the chat box. I don't recall off the top of my head how many we have, but it may be somewhere in the realm of 40 to 50 have been created. And typically they're done on a county by county basis. And so the hope is that groups that can speak about needs of communities and leaders can come together as part of these long-term recovery groups and share locally, this is what we're seeing, this is what we have resources for, connecting resources to those needs, and just coordinating response in general. And then as resources dry up, as need overwhelms available resources, they get elevated to the statewide North Carolina VOAD level to bring in supplemental resources and support the local communities as needed. And that can be bringing out-of-state partners in, them with local organizations, or moving resources around from one part of the state to the other.
So I'm hearing all disasters start local and they end local, and that one of the challenges and one of the opportunities that NC VOAD and the associated long-term recovery groups have is making sure that everybody in a community is involved. And I'm going back to this question around trust and language accessibility keeps coming up for folks. I want to ask Caroline. Caroline Farmer is in the governor's office She is the executive director of the North Carolina Commission on Volunteerism, who has been really, we know that I think 54% of the folks on this call are with nonprofits. So this is, so to say, Caroline's people. Caroline, you know, what is it that that the governor's office is doing to prioritize the Latinx communities in particular?
You know, I think that there's subtle things that are going on. I do think that the governor's very aware of the public health concerns that are, and these are not new. I mean, the pandemic just makes things worse. And so he's got a policy team working on how we can address that, as well as with Health and Human Services, Mandy Cohen and her team. So, you know, that's been a priority. He also put me in charge of the feeding, and that's part of the reason why is because I want to make sure we're hitting everybody. I want to make sure that everyone is connected to the food, to the services, to the education. And so that's part and parcel of what he, as governor and as leader, as my boss, is making sure that we are paying attention to all folks that are residents here and making sure they're getting what they need. So, which is why we're having this call, is to connect those services and those people. I have full blessing to be involved in doing all of this. So,
folks who are in communities who want to be living out that local, you know, disasters start and end locally. You know, who's the #1 agency or person that they should be connecting with locally?
So, okay, this kind of, it's perfect that I'm at the end. So what Sandi was talking about was emergency, you know, that state takes the cues from the locals. So it's incredibly important for you as advocates, as people who are out there assisting our Latino neighbors, that you are communicating locally with your emergency manager. And if you have not introduced or made sure or find out who it is that you are going to communicate with if there is a disaster, I would encourage you to reach out now. Now, I fully admit that that may not do anything, but you should do it, and you should make that effort and make that contact. But then I also want you to connect with, as Daniel and Ross were talking about, with the VOADs, with these organizations that are always out there helping and making sure, because if you're, like in some of your counties, your local emergency manager may also be the fire chief. They may also be handling the medical issues as well. That's a lot for them to handle, and they need more staff during that time. So that's where it's a beautiful thing that we have the Catholic Charities, Salvation Army assisting. And so there's a lot of concern too with people not getting communication. And Ross and I have talked about this before, is we want to make sure that if there's a food truck available, that the Baptist on Mission or Red Cross or whoever, if they're serving, we want to make sure that that message is getting out to the populations that you're serving. So I want to make sure that you're hearing about them, that we are communicating with you about them, so that you can communicate in turn to the people that you're serving. And I think I kind of went off script there, but.
But what I heard you saying is trying to get connected with the county emergency management. And I also heard you admitting that it's not going to work in every county, that not every county has the resources, not every county has the right person in the role to understand what it means to do that kind of community outreach. And so that places an extra burden on the organizations and advocates on this call to really press on them and to work with each other across those county lines to get attention.
Yes, please.
I want to ask. I'm gonna pause there with the panel. We're gonna come back with this sort of core question around partnerships again. but I want us to go into breakout groups. Sarah, talk to us about breakout groups again this time.
Entonces, vamos a regresar a nuestros grupos.
So we're going to go back to our working groups, and in the working groups, we're going to talk about 3 questions that those of us from Rural Forward love. So what is the mutual aid that we can provide? And so taking into account everything that we've heard about response to disasters on the state level, on the organization level, on the level of organizations, thinking about all of this, what is right, what's wrong, what's missing, and what's surprising.
While you're doing that, you should also see that there's a resource that Angela just dropped in from our one of our media partners, community partners at Enlace Latino. I want to turn back to our panel and well, you take 1 second here. So we do have just a few more minutes, but I want to ask, keep dropping stuff into the chat. And again, all of this stuff that ends up in the chat is going to be summarized into a set of meeting summary. I'll say in the group that I was in, there was a connection already made about a need to work with Spanish language radio stations. And that was an interesting idea. Angela mentioning that the article explains a new state fund for anyone who is put in quarantine regardless of immigration status. And that's perhaps in response to a question earlier about what resources are available based on documentation status and immigration status. All right. I'm going to open it up. Caroline, Daniel, Ross. How can partnerships with community leaders strengthen resiliency? And specifically, how are you working with Latino, Latinx, Hispanic community organizations?
Who wants to go?
Kick us off, Caroline.
So how am I working with Latino populations? You know, ever since, you know, starting March 18th, I think is when we started doing the first educational seminars. So Maddie Lazo Chatterton, some of you may know, is a coworker at the governor's office, and so I reached out to her about ways of communicating and explaining what's going on, because this is, you know, this has been an evolving problem, the pandemic wise, and so we've been trying to make sure that every week, every couple weeks, that we are hitting a topic in a deeper dive that might be helpful to some advocacy. So that's one of the many areas that we've been involved in. All right, next, somebody else.
I can jump in. For NC VOAD, primarily we're a convener, not an action agency ourselves. And so we rely on our member agencies for their outreach and how they connect with the Latino community. And so I know the American Red Cross, following Hurricane Florence, set up a task force that was focused specifically on making connections in the Latino community and trying to hear from them and understand how they could respond. I know with the Methodists, they recently got a grant from the American Red Cross to focus on disaster preparation among Latino communities in Pender, Brunswick, Robeson, and Cumberland County. And so they're working on, and their call-in line is now both bilingual English and Spanish. So as people need help repairing their homes, it's more accessible to Spanish-speaking individuals. And then at Catholic Charities, as a VOAD member agency, we have a lot of bilingual staff in our offices. We have an immigration program that we pair with our disaster program for connection into the Hispanic community. And we've got 2 Hispanic-focused centers in Raleigh and Burlington. So we partner with those existing programs through the disaster program to really conduct outreach to the Latino and Hispanic community. And so one of the big things that I will say is that's how our member organizations do the work. It would be great to have more involvement of representatives from the Latino community actually in VOAD. And so I'll get on my little 60-second soapbox and really ask for anyone that's interested, has time. I know time is very valuable and stretched right now, but hearing and participating in the conversations, it doesn't have to start with membership. It can be simply joining our mailing list, getting on phone calls as they're scheduled, to make connections, hear what's going on, and advocate for your communities. And if it's appropriate, joining as members. If not, that's fine. It's still very open. And at the core, what I care about with NC VOAD is that coordination, that communication, and that collaboration. And so thanks, Andy dropped the link to our website where you can sign up for the mailing list and get more information. But that I would love to hear from more people that are on this call, in that call and in those groups as well. And if anyone has questions, feel free to come offline, and I'm happy to talk more about it.
We have 5 minutes left. Dan, some of the things that you were talking about reminded me of what Mace Robinson, who is in my group. Mace, I hope it's okay that I'm speaking for you a little bit, but Mace is with the American Red Cross in the northeastern part of the state, and saying that one of the things that they are looking for is more Spanish speaking, more bilingual and bicultural volunteers, and because we know how critical that is to making, to building trust and building connections. And one of the things that the American Red Cross is doing is holding volunteer trainings virtually and completely in Spanish, because we know that things get lost in translation. We have just about 5 minutes left. I'm gonna ask Sarah to help wrap us up here, because time flies so quickly, and there is more, there's so much more to talk about.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank all of you for your participation. And we have a few questions that we were going to ask you in the groups if we had time, but we don't have any. So I'm going to put them in the chat so that you can think about these. And you can write in the chat, what are the things you want to change? What is missing? What do we like? What do we not like? What is surprising to us? And then this is what, how we come to this question. What are the changes that we want? And who do we need to know, and who do we need to get to know to make those changes? And then in the group that I was in, I saw people communicating, sharing information to make specific changes in their communities. We want to know from each one of you, what are your answers to this? And we can probably put you in contact with the people that you need to know. So I also see in the chat a question from Caroline. Should we use WhatsApp to send emergency notifications from the state? And I see here Also in the chat, yes. For example, the majority of migrant workers only have telephone numbers that are foreign. So any other thoughts? That it would be a good change having emergency notifications on WhatsApp. Can you put that on the chat, or a thumbs up, thumbs down? I'm also seeing, what do we want to change? We want to create better connections with the state and also do more calls like this. Thank you so much, Ali. And we also have some positive responses to using WhatsApp. There's a lot of people who want to use WhatsApp for these notifications. So I'm also seeing in the chat that it's important to recognize that Google Translate is not sufficient. It does not serve us for translation. It's not good for translation. The idea is a good one, but you have to consider also the people who don't read, the people who can't read. It's a really good thing to understand that there are different levels of literacy in the communities, and not all of the Latinos speak Spanish as their first language. So thank you so much for sharing all this information. Keep putting your feedback in the chat and keep in touch with us. If we can connect you to anybody to help you, we're glad to do that. We're going to keep sharing information. Thank you so much to everybody. We're also going to send you an evaluation. We're going to share it there in the chat. If you can copy and paste into your browser to offer your feedback for the meeting. We want to keep making everything better. We want to keep improving all of this for you. Thank you so much for everybody for your participation. And we will be here next week on the 10th of September on the same time, same day. And the topic is going to be advocating for your community's rights during a disaster. And we're going to have panelists from Legal Aid of North Carolina, attorneys and legal assistants so that they can give answers to your questions about how to advocate as community leaders for your community. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much to everyone.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See y'all next week. Thank you.
Hasta la próxima.
Que les vaya muy, muy bien.
Gracias.
Me gustó conocerlos a todos. Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Hasta luego.
Gracias. Mandaremos las notas de la sesión y del chat.
We'll send the notes from the session and the chat. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Bye.